Hi, I'm Vince Slough, coming to you from near Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, where I'm a professor of service operations management. I study data driven models for staffing challenges, and in particular, the challenge of consistent assignment in long term care settings has interested me for several years. With the COVID 19 crisis, we've seen some states and the CMS put out guidance, such as this, promoting the use of consistent assignment within long term care facilities. They suggest it can reduce and avoid transmission of diseases within the facilities and cite the traditional reasons for why consistent assignment is good. For example, it enhances staff's familiarity with their assigned patients. There are many good resources out there about how to change culture to promote consistent assignment when doing scheduling, but I also find it to be a very complicated and interesting mathematical problem. Hopefully, through this presentation, you can understand some of the basic numbers behind consistent assignment and understand where your organization might be through some basic benchmarking. If we want to think about this scientifically, we need some sort of metric to guide us. We're going to use maybe the most common metric for consistent assignment, which has been promoted by the Advancing Excellence in America's Nursing Homes campaign and several other organizations. And this is the consistency score. This is a count of the number of different caregivers who work at least one shift in a unit over the course of 1 month. It's almost as if we would just count up the number of different caregivers who walk into each resident's room in a month and have that as our score. We can calculate this for one specific unit, or we can calculate it for each unit in the facility and then take an average. We can look only at the certified nursing assistants, or we can do it for all nursing staff. And lower is better. We want to spread the care load out of a small, reasonable number of caregivers. We don't want a situation where there are many different people rotating in and out, just covering a shift here or there. That would hurt our consistency of care. One question to ask with this is, what's the best possible consistency score for our particular unit with our current workforce? There are two pieces of data required. The first one is the average number of shifts staffed per day per unit. Maybe you have 2 CNAs working the day shift, 2 working the evening shift, and 1 working the night shift. Well, that would be an average of 5 shifts that you would need to staff per day. Then you need the average number of shifts worked per caregiver. That is, if you have people, an all full-time workforce, it's probably going to be around 20 or a little above that. Each worker is going to work about 20 shifts a month. If you have a part-time workforce, or a workforce with many part-time workers, you'd expect that to be lower than 20. Take those two pieces of information, and we're going to get the best consistency score. And this is going to be the situation if you have a completely separate workforce where each caregiver only ever works in one unit. That's an ideal. That's pretty hard to accomplish, but it's what's being promoted, especially now where you worry about infections. You want to ideally separate your caregivers so that they only ever work in one unit, and you have separate groups of caregivers working with separate groups of residents. But to calculate the best possible consistency score, we're going to take our average number of shifts staffed per day per unit, multiply it by 30 days. So if I was doing 5 per day times 30 days, that's 150. It's 150 shifts that we need to staff. And let's think about then our second piece of data. We're going to divide it by that. We're going to divide it by our average number of shifts worked per caregiver. So let's say we have roughly half of our workforce part-time people who are working 10 shifts a month, and the other half is full-time people working 20 shifts a month, and averages out to 15. So in this case, we have 150 divided by 15. That would be our best consistency. Our consistency score is 10. So there, that example was 150 over 15 equals 10 for our best possible consistency score, meaning best case scenario, we would need 10 different CNAs to fill the shifts in that unit in a month. There's no way that we would get under 10. Having just calculated the best possible consistency of care score with your current workforce, a natural thing to do is to take it and compare it to your current score. What was the consistency of care that residents actually experienced last month? If you have your schedules digitized, great. If not, perhaps it's worth taking an hour of someone's time to type up who worked in which unit on which shift on which day, and then use a spreadsheet to figure out how many different people worked in each unit over the course of the month. There's another video available showing how to do that I created. You take these two numbers and compare them. How close are you getting to the best possible consistency of care? I worked with some organizations that are pretty close and some that where there's a significant gap. This gap is the room for improvement. We'll call it the scheduling gap here. That's the gap between our best possible and our consistency that our residents are actually experiencing. To give you some numerical examples for that, in one organization with small units, so 10 to 12 residents in most of the units, they needed, in an ideal world, they would only need 12 different CNAs to cover all of the shifts in each unit that needed to be covered. But when I looked at their schedule and counted up how many different CNAs were working at least one shift in each unit, it ended up being about 28. In another facility that had larger groups of residents, say about 25 or 30 residents grouped together, they would need, that facility would have been able to cover all shifts over the course of the month with a minimum, best case, of 20 different CNAs. In reality, when I looked at the schedule, it actually took 39 different CNAs to cover all shifts in that month. So those are significant gaps. We'll talk a little bit more about how we can reduce the best possible number, and reduce this scheduling gap. The best possible consistency of care score that we've talked about so far is with our current workforce. How would that change? How would that score change if we had an ideal workforce? We could do better if we can increase the average number of shifts per worker. So maybe we have more full-time workers, maybe more overtime instead of fewer part-time and contract workers. Now, this could be really challenging to do, but I just wanted to point out that if you can do it, it will improve the consistency of care. The other idea would be to split our large units of residents into smaller units and schedule CNAs to groups of 10 to 15 residents instead of 30 to 40 residents if you are an organization that has large groups of residents to which you schedule. How would that change the data? Well, if we increase the average number of shifts per worker, that's going to make this go up, and that's going to, let me translate that here, that's going to make our best possible consistency score go down. And if we can reduce the number of shifts that we staff per day per unit, because we split a large unit into a small unit, that will make that go down, and that will make our numerator over here go down, so our best possible consistency of care score would go down. We can take this best case scenario for what consistency of care would look like with an ideal workforce, and we can add it to our bench as a third mark. That allows us to see a second gap. So we had our scheduling gap before. Now we have a workforce gap. And a workforce gap shows us how much we can improve consistency of care by changing something about our workforce. The example I gave a few slides ago was that we needed to cover 150 shifts over the course of a month, and each of our CNAs was on average working 15 shifts in a month. Well, that was 10. Let's say we had to cover those 150 shifts, but we were able to incentivize people to contribute more shifts per month, more full-time, more through full-time, overtime, however you would find it possible to do it. And on average, CNAs were now working 20 shifts a month instead of 15. Well, that would change our calculation to 7.5, or we would need 8 different CNAs to cover those 150 shifts, and that shows how we could here reduce our best possible score with our current workforce, how we could decrease that using an ideal workforce where the CNAs where your average CNA is working more shifts. To repeat that, our workforce gap is the difference between our best possible consistency of care with our current workforce and what we could achieve in terms of the consistency score with an ideal workforce. The way we could get that ideal consistency of care, things we would want to do in an organization, if possible, are to have more full-time workers, more overtime to allow workers to contribute more shifts per month, so you can spread the number of shifts needed over a smaller pool of workers, or you could split large units of residents into smaller units. These all might or might not be possible for your organization, might or might not be a good idea depending on the other consequences of those decisions, but they are things that help explain how the consistency of care score could be improved, how it could be lowered. The second gap that we're going to look at is our scheduling gap. This explains why the best possible consistency of care score without changing our current workforce explains why that's different from the current score that residents experience. We're going to take that a step further. So we have our best possible with our current workforce. We're going to have our best possible with our perfect scheduling. So look at last month. If everyone showed up to the exact same shifts on the exact same days, and you could just change around who worked where, what's the best possible that you could have done? So we're going to divide our scheduling gap into 2 different gaps and talk about ways that you can improve consistency of care, some other practices without changing anything about your workforce. What I'd like to do is divide the schedule gap into the availability gap and the assignment gap to answer the question of why an organization that could have filled all shifts with its current workforce at 12 different CNAs per month was struggling and using about 28 different CNAs to fill the shift. So I wanted to see where the trouble lay in this challenge, and I want to divide it into 2 questions. Was it more difficult to answer the who works when question, to put together the schedule of who's working on which shifts, or was it the who works where question? Once you know who's working, is it assigning workers to different units? For a couple different facilities, I found that they really struggle with the who works where decision, which is admittedly very, very complicated. I needed to solve it. I used some really high-powered computational techniques. I wanted to see if I had a perfect vision of the future as a scheduler, and I knew exactly who was going to show up on which days, and knew that perfectly. How could what's the best possible consistency score that I could have achieved with my schedule? Looking at this for the organization that was at 28, but ideally could have been at 12. they were struggling a lot more with the who works where decision. Not figuring out who's working, but figuring out, given who's working, where should those caregivers work. Now, there are a lot of challenges and regulations with that they were facing, but they certainly had a significant assignment gap here. Some of it is making sure that your scheduler is equipped with that information about who has worked in certain units, who having clear home units for each of the aides, even your part-time aides or your contract workers, is important. With more information, hopefully the scheduler can fill out this roster puzzle better. Absences can throw a wrench into this problem, so any ways to facilitate that communication about absences and how to handle absences in a way that hopefully doesn't hurt consistency of care can be helpful. And I've done some research and some analysis of these schedules. The part-time and contract workers were actually playing an outsized role in hurting consistency of care. So you want to pay attention to the consistency of care that they are doing. Even if someone's only working 6 shifts in a month, you want to try to assign them to work in the same unit for those 6 shifts if possible. That's easier said than done. But one thing that can help this is if you can identify a few full-time workers who are willing to have a primary unit and a home unit, you can actually achieve this. You can achieve a lot of the benefits of being able to be flexible with your roster and shift people around to try to achieve consistency. I've done more research about this. Hopefully there will be some of some of these high-tech scheduling companies will be able to help guide this very complicated decision for schedulers. But I think there's a lot of opportunity just to improve with these simple rules. Just being conscious of everyone's home unit and trying to assign them to home units as much as possible. And if you just make sure that the part-time workers aren't working 6 shifts in 4 different units, things like that. This assignment gap was the challenging gap for several organizations that I worked with. There's also a final gap, the availability gap, which indicates that there was some sort of challenge with getting everyone to coordinated so that you could have people show up in a manner that you could schedule them consistently. There might still be challenges if the right set of people aren't working, or a set of people that could be consistently assigned to units aren't working on any given day. You might have problems even with the best assignment algorithm. If the right set of people aren't working, where you have someone from each unit, where you have the right number of people who have each unit as their home unit working on that particular day, if that's not happening, you could have some challenges. So that's a little bit harder for me to say anything scientific based on the data, but making sure that you get people into good work cycle patterns, and then improving culture, communication, and planning, so you know who's on, who's off, and have workers invested in the idea of consistency of care, so that the scheduler's job is easier. That could help you reduce this availability gap. To conclude, I want to repeat that this challenge of consistent assignment is very difficult to achieve. It has many complications operationally and technically, but hopefully these preliminary thoughts can help you understand it a little bit better and break it down into a couple parts so you can see what directions you want to try to push your organization. Hopefully you see the benefits of consistency of care. Research has shown many advantages for staff and for residents, and intuitively, it just makes sense that you want a small stable group of caregivers for each resident to provide them as much of a home-like experience as possible. Give a couple key takeaways for what I've presented. Try to know your numbers through calculating them with the best possible consistency of care, through looking at your schedules to get your actual consistency of care, and think how you can promote consistent assignment when you're working through the following decisions, the following questions in your organization. How many shifts per month is your average caregiver working? Is this full-time, part-time status? What's the composition of your workforce look like? Who's scheduled to work on each shift? How are you making that decision? What are your constraints that you're running into with availability? On any given shift then, the third question, where is each caregiver assigned to work? Are you doing in a way that makes sure that people are working in their home units as much as possible, or that part-time staff aren't just getting thrown up in the air and landing randomly in different units on each shift? How can you promote consistency within that who works where decision? Feel free to reach out to me at this email address if I can ever provide help. I've worked with a couple great organizations and great people on this, but I'm still interested in learning more about the landscape of challenges that organizations out there are facing. I certainly wish everyone the best in addressing the staffing challenges, especially now. Please feel free to reach out to me if I can ever be helpful.